Welcome to Inside the Studio, the official podcast of the Texas Heart Institute at Baylor College of Medicine. I'm Dr. Joseph Rogers, and together we'll explore the ever-evolving world of cardiovascular care. In each episode, we bring you conversations with the people shaping the future of heart and vascular health, cardiologists on the front lines of patient care, surgeons performing groundbreaking procedures, and scientists leading discoveries that will change medicine for generations. We'll also highlight perspectives from international leaders and community voices who share our commitment to preventing, diagnosing, and treating heart disease. Whether you're a physician, a researcher, a patient, or simply curious about the latest in heart health, this podcast is your inside look at innovation, education, and care at the highest level. So let's step inside the studio. Hi, I'm Dr. Joe Rogers, and I'm the director of the Texas Heart Institute at Baylor College of Medicine. And I'm joined in the studio today by one of my colleagues, Dr. Steve Maximus, who's just given grand rounds on endovascular stent grafting and physician-modified grafts. And Steve, it was really a wonderful talk, and we're happy to have you in the studio just to follow up with a few questions. And I just want to say, it was particularly enjoyable today because your wife and your son could join us for Grand Rounds today. It was really wonderful to meet them. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it was an honor to be present. I was really happy that they were able to come. So it was very enjoyable.
Great. Well, listen, it was a real tour de force today. I mean, you really walked through a large array of options that patients with aortic aneurysmal disease, have, especially here. And you, I think, highlighted some of the unique aspects of the program at Baylor and Baylor St. Luke's. I probably ought to start with some more sort of general questions about aortic diseases. And I'm very interested, first, in exploring a little bit more about this relationship between volumes of procedures and outcomes. And I think you highlighted this nicely in Grand Rounds, but maybe we could just explore a little bit more about your thoughts regarding, for those of our viewers who are watching this and have patients who have aneurysmal disease, how do those people pick the right surgeon to do their cases?
Well, certainly, I think it depends on the patient and the type of disease. I think if it's a straightforward aneurysm where you can put an EVAR graft, I think a lot of places are equipped to do that. Well, that's where you have a really good neck landing zone. We talked about landing zone. So you want to have a good neck, probably about at least 15 millimeters, if not 20 millimeters. And I think if you have good anatomy, doing a straightforward EVAR, I think a lot of places can do that. Now, when you start to go higher up, when you involve the renal arteries, the mesenteric arteries, now you're talking about complex aortic devices. And it's been shown in multiple studies that high-volume centers perform these procedures with better outcomes compared to institutions that do not. Yeah. There's a learning curve with these. I will tell you, if you look at, Dr. Rich has a great paper that splits his experience up in quartiles. So his first 80 cases at Mayo compared to his second 80 cases, compared to his third 80 cases, and his his last 80 cases. And the results are significantly better in the last 80 patients. And obviously the worst quartile is the first 80. And my experience as well. My first 20 or so, there was a learning curve. If you take my first 70 cases, the outcomes were good, but my last 50 or so, the outcomes are much, much, much better. Part of that is the institution, getting used to what you are doing, and the ICU and the nursing and the OR and all the ancillary staff. You're doing something new that not a lot of places do, and it takes a while for them to get used to what you need and all the things. But a lot of that is the physician too and the operator. These are not easy cases. It's not just putting up wire, throwing a stent graft. The anatomy can be very difficult, can be very challenging. And some of it is patient selection too. I think you need to know when a patient is too high risk, even for an endovascular repair. We sometimes will see it as, well, we're just putting some stents up, we're not clamping the aorta, it's not going to be high risk. But there are patients who are high risk, and there are patients who have very unfavorable anatomy, patients who are, both myself and Dr. Aortic and the team have turned down for endovascular repair because they are just way too high risk, and particularly a very shaggy aorta with a lot of atheroma debris. Those patients, tend to do very poorly because you embolize everywhere. And the few, complications that we've had are usually patients who've had that issue. Patients with other risk factors, occluded hypogastrics, things like that, they can be at higher risk for spinal cord ischemia too. So some of it is patient selection and having the experience to know what the complications you can run into.
Can you help us understand a little bit how we should be thinking about open versus endo repairs? A lot of the people who will watch this podcast may not have access to a skilled physician who does endo and really just has a group of people that does open. How do you think about doing open versus endo?
So we still do a decent amount of open ourselves outside of Dr. Caselli. Dr. Caselli obviously does more open than anyone in the world. Does it better than anyone in the world. But let's talk about just infrarenals. I think if you're still a young patient and young in our world is, under 70. If you're under 70, you're young. So if you're a young patient and you're relatively healthy, there's a risk benefit. And everything comes, and I think it comes down to shared decision making. I can probably do an open procedure for you, and it's pretty high likelihood, not 100%, but a pretty high likelihood that we do fix your AAA open for an infrarenal. And you're probably not going to need anything else for the rest of your life. Whereas if I do it endovascularly, you're probably going to go home the next day. You're going to have 2 pokes in your groin, but you still will need a CT scan every year or an ultrasound. And there's probably about a 10 to 20% chance that this degenerates and I either have to come back a few years later and take it out open anyways, or we have to do a more complex procedure that carries higher risk endovascularly. So really it's that trade-off. I think if you're very fit for an open repair, I still think an open repair is superior, especially for infrarenal. For thoracoabdominal, you really have to consider the complications that come with that because they are much higher. But I do think in that space as well, I think an open repair is still the gold standard in terms of durability. So you're paying a price. You're either going to pay the price up front or you're going to pay the price. I used to have a tenant who said, it's pay me now or pay me later. So it's exactly that situation.
And I think that you touched on something I would like you just to emphasize, and that is the follow-up for endo repairs. It sounds like, just based on what you said, it's an annual evaluation with some imaging study.
Correct.
Does it matter, CT, ultrasound?
I think ultrasound is fine as long as you have, radiology techs or ultrasound techs with experience who know what they're looking at and people who can interpret that. I think ultrasound is absolutely fine. Usually our practice is we get, for open, we get one ultrasound or a CT scan after the repair, and then we don't need to see again for 5 years. In 5 years, we'll check to see if you've degenerated or had a thoracic aneurysm, because a number of these patients have concomitant thoracic aneurysms develop. But otherwise, you're good. For EVAR, ultrasound is fine too. That's totally acceptable. And usually the algorithm for that is we'll do an ultrasound or CT at 1 month, and then yearly ultrasound or CT scan. For complex aneurysms, that becomes a little bit more complicated because now you're talking about renal arteries, mesenteric arteries, and ultrasound can be useful, but it's much more difficult. So usually we do CT scan. For our IDEs, both of them, the protocol is, follow up usually one CT scan at 1 to 3 months, one at 6 months to a year, and then yearly for 5 years, and really yearly for life. That's really the protocol. So I think the main thing for patients to take away is that if you've had an endovascular aortic repair, you need to have somebody looking at it every year in some modality.
Good. I think that's really an important thing to emphasize for all of us. Would you talk about the ways in which spinal cord protection has evolved over the past, 5 or 10 years?
It's evolved quite a bit in all our practices, evolved in my individual practice as well. Usually for extensive coverage, the thought was more than 20 centimeters of aortic coverage, you'd need a lumbar drain to relieve the pressure in the spine, to improve the inflow. You're basically decreasing the afterload on the spine is the way I think of it, and you improve the inflow to get more perfusion to the spine. What we have found is that staging these procedures helps. So if you're going to have an extent to thoraco, meaning an aneurysm that starts basically at the left subclavian and goes all the way down to the iliac arteries. Instead of fixing it all at once, you split it up into stages, meaning the first stage is the TVAR, so you'll go from the left subclavian, sometimes a branch graft incorporating left subclavian, down to just above the celiac artery. Do that, wait 4-6 weeks. Nobody knows the right answer of exactly when to wait, but it seems that 4 weeks is about the time. At that point, the spine actually forms an excellent collateral network, and that's actually been shown. There's a couple of good papers with great papers from neurosurgeons and neuro-IR that shows that network developing, and it's really impressive how quickly it develops. So you let the collateral flow develop, and then you come back and fix the rest of the aneurysm. And that's decreased our paraplegia rates quite a bit. I think with this, with spinal cord protection, with not with lumbar drains, but just with staging the procedures, being cognizant of that, being cognizant of the risk factors too. If you have a occluded left subclavian, we know that leads to spinal cord ischemia, so we make every effort to preserve that. Occluded internal iliacs, spinal cord ischemia. So we have branch grafts now that are off the shelf and work very well for the left subclavian and iliac branch. We have 2 companies that actually make these devices now, so now there's more than one option. So really, the days of just covering a hypo or embolizing it and putting a stent or covering the left subclavian, that practice should probably be ended. If you can save it, you should. Now, there are emergencies that you have to do what you have to do, but it's basically a level A recommendation that you should preserve all branches if possible. So that has helped tremendously. It used to be that we would put lumbar drains routinely, and what we found that the complication rate with lumbar drains was about 10%, all comers. So it's not for free. There's risk of epidural hematoma, stroke, other complications, infection, all these things that can occur. I think if you're in a center where you have, again, this is why the high volume centers tend to have better outcomes, is if we need a lumbar drain here at Baylor St. Luke's, we have a number of people who can place them, and they get it in 20 minutes. Other institutions, it may take hours. You may not get it. So if you're at an institution where you can't get a lumbar drain expeditiously, it may be safer to place a lumbar drain preoperatively to make sure you have it if you need it, but it does come with complications.
And when you're placing them post-operatively, are you placing them almost immediately post-operatively?
So usually what we found is that our patients who develop lower extremity weakness, it's not always immediately post-op. In fact, usually it's post-op day 1 or even post-op day 2. They get out of bed, or their blood pressure is a little bit lower, and their legs feel weak, or they can't move their legs. And so that's the time where you have to act as if it's a fire drill and get that drain in them right away. And so we're very fortunate here that we have such expertise in cardiac anesthesiology, and they're used to dealing with this, that, as soon as they notice the patient's leg is weak, they call us in the ICU and they say, we're putting in a drain.
I've had to retrain myself on this concept of permissive hypertension.
Yes.
Because, I would walk in and I'd see the blood pressure high, and my first reaction was, I've got to get this blood pressure down. And the vascular surgeons are always saying, no, just leave it for a few days.
Yeah, we like to keep them at least above 130 systolic, if not even higher. And I'll tell the ICU, as long as they're not over 180. But that's the other thing too, right, is that we have to make sure their heart is okay, that they can tolerate that. And that's where it's so vital that we have good preoperative workup. Because, we're going to probably put a little bit of stress on your heart. And if you can't tolerate that, then you're going to have a complication. So all this stuff is learning that we have learned. And I think that's why the experience matters. I think if not as experienced, you let their blood pressure get a little bit lower, and, they could end up with the spinal cord injury.
So I would like to just, as we close, spend a little bit of time on physician-modified grafts, which I think is just such an unbelievably interesting part of the story that you and Gustavo have, sort of brought to this institution. It was interesting to hear at the end of your talk the suggestion that maybe as not custom-made devices, but as sort of manufactured devices become more sophisticated.
Yes.
That this actually, the need for these may go down in some significant way. I mean, what is really, from your perspective, what does the future of physician-modified grafts look like 5 or 10 years from now?
Well, as someone who does these and has an idea, I hope they decrease, because I'm not in the manufacturing business. I don't want to be manufacturing the devices, but we don't have off-the-shelf options that will fit everyone. It takes a while to get a custom-made device. I think it will decrease. The ZFan Plus device, I think, will be commercially available, hopefully within the next year or two. And that will be really the only other 4-vessel device, but that will be tailored to the patient's anatomy. You can actually have 5 vessels on that device, so it would be 4 or 5, but you'll still have to order it. You'll have to wait however time it takes to manufacture the device. So having something in situations where you have symptomatic aneurysms, large aneurysms where they can't wait, contained ruptures or even ruptures, that is probably where physician-modified grafts will come in. So I think the use will decrease as more institutions have access to these fenestrated, custom-built devices, which should happen hopefully within the next year or two. But for now, it's really the Gortambi device, which is off the shelf, one size fits all, doesn't fit everyone, is a good device, but doesn't fit everyone.
Listen, I can't thank you enough. Grand Rounds was really amazing. It's always fun to have a surgical Grand Rounds because some of the technical work that you're doing is absolutely spectacular, and we always learn so much from you. And we're happy to have you here. We're fortunate to have you and your expertise working with us and to the benefit of our patients. So, Steve, thanks again for joining us here in the studio.
Thanks again, Joe. I really appreciate the opportunity. It certainly was an honor.
Absolutely.